So this is one of the most misunderstood things I find among people who don't know the Hebrew Bible well, either because they can't read it in Hebrew or they haven't read the texts that accompany it, or for any number of other reasons that they've misunderstood and misinterpreted it. So you have to begin by understanding that the Jewish tradition, since long before the time of Jesus, has always read the Hebrew Bible together with the interpretations that have been set out by various authorities from the beginning. And so probably the most famous of those interpretations is called the Talmud. The Talmud is 63 volumes. This is it right behind me. It was written down it begins to be written down in the year 200, just shortly after the Gospels are written. So more or less contemporaneous with the New Testament. But in fact, the traditions that it records are an oral history that are much older than that. And it's a little bit tricky, and there's lots of debate about how far different traditions go back, but clearly all the traditions go back at least a few hundred years from when it was written. So by the time Jesus comes around, for example, pretty much everything that was in the Talmud was already oral tradition among the Jewish people, and that's where we go to understand what was the contemporaneous understanding of various texts in the Bible. We just don't read them and assume we can understand them without contemporaneous kind of explanations. So there's two things in the Hebrew Bible that are the subject of a great deal of confusion. The first one is there are quite a few offenses that are mentioned for which the death penalty, or you shall be put to death, or some variation of that, is mentioned as the punishment. But if you read the Talmud, and not only the Talmud, this is one of dozens of contemporary commentaries, you find out that in fact, nobody was ever put to death for any of these offenses. I can give you example after example of the way they interpreted the offenses so that nobody could ever become eligible for the death penalty. One example is witnesses. So before you could be eligible for the death penalty, there had to be two witnesses, eyewitnesses, both of whom viewed the particular event from different angles, and one of whom at least warned you specifically in advance that if you do this, you will be subject to the death penalty. Well, what's the chance of that happening? Not too much. Another example, it says, a wayward son shall be put to death. That would mean when your teenager acts up, he should be given the death penalty. Is that what the Bible is saying? Well, obviously, common sense tells you that that's not what they meant. So in the Talmud, a wayward son is called a ben sorer in Hebrew, and they explain that there's a problem with the text because a son is a minor, normally, a child. Problem is, it specifically says that children are not subject to the death penalty. So how can it be? You've got an inconsistency that has to be resolved. And the way they end up resolving this, some of this gets very complex, the reasoning, and we don't have time to go into all the sort of the doctrines that are used to understand it in its own time. But the way it gets resolved is to say there's only a short period in a life, but right around puberty, that you could even be a ben sorer, that you can be a wayward son. It's after you're no longer a child, but not quite an adult. A period that normally lasts for a couple of months. Then they say, well, what does it mean to be wayward? And they say, well, to do that, and they figure it out. They go through very complicated understanding of the Hebrew and looking at how it fits with everything else. And they say that you have to eat, I don't remember the number, but it's something like 8 pounds of beef and drink 12 liters of Italian wine all in one meal. So anybody who did that would get the death penalty. And how often do you think that happened? And case after case, this is how it went. In one of the tractates of the Talmud called Sanhedrin, which is the rules that apply to courts, one rabbi says that any court that imposes the death penalty once in every 7 years is considered a harsh court. And then he's corrected by the other rabbis who say, no, it's once every 70 years. So as far as this idea that the death penalty is generally supported because of the various offenses that require it in the Hebrew Bible, it's refuted by the actual practice and the explanation of the actual practice that was contemporaneous with the time. So the question you might ask is, well, why does it say it then if you're not going to actually do it? And the answer is because the Hebrew Bible wants to make a statement about how serious we judge these things. And it wants to say that we consider these particular offenses to be quite heinous. And it wants to even hold it out there, this idea that you're subject to the harshest punishment. And so that's kind of what we call the judgment side of the law, a strict, we have values that we stand by strictly, and we want to make those values plain. At the same time, there's the compassion side. And the compassion side says, look, we're never really going to do this. But we're not going to tell you that, because if we tell you that ahead of time, then you might do these things. And so it tries to balance the whole theme of the Hebrew Bible is to try to balance judgment and compassion. When it comes to something as severe as the death penalty, compassion wins 99.999% of the time.